It sounds like one of the greatest business ideas in the world. You build a place where people come to have fun, they pay you to get in, they buy your food, they buy your merchandise, they go home happy, and then they come back next summer and do it all over again. It's basically a machine that turns joy into money. And on the surface, it really does seem that simple. But the moment you start pulling back the curtain on how amusement parks actually work, the real costs, the financing structures, the seasonal economics, the regulatory maze, the maintenance schedules, the staffing nightmares, you realize that this is one of the most brutally difficult businesses on earth to run profitably. And the gap between a park that thrives for 100 years and one that quietly closes its gates forever often comes down to decisions most visitors never think about at all. So let's actually talk about the economics of owning an amusement park. Not the fantasy version, the real one. The amusement park industry in the United States alone generates somewhere around $20 to $24 billion in annual revenue. Globally, that number pushes well past $60 billion. There are roughly 400 traditional amusement and theme parks operating in the U.S. At any given time, ranging from Disney's massive resort empires to small regional parks tucked into rural communities that most people outside a 2-hour radius have never heard of. And that range is important because those two types of parks are almost entirely different businesses operating under the same general label. When people think amusement park, they usually picture Disney World or Universal Studios places with billion-dollar IP, custom-built lands, cinematic theming, and hotel ecosystems attached. But those parks represent maybe a dozen properties globally. The overwhelming majority of amusement parks are regional parks. Places like Cedar Point in Ohio, Dollywood in Tennessee, Carowinds in North Carolina, or Kennywood in Pennsylvania. Parks that built their identity around rides, tradition, and regional loyalty rather than globally recognized characters. And understanding how those parks actually make and spend money tells you almost everything you need to know about the economics of this industry. Let's start at the beginning, because you can't talk about amusement park economics without talking about the land and infrastructure that makes everything possible, and how shockingly expensive it is before a single ticket is ever sold. Building a new amusement park from the ground up is not something many entrepreneurs actually attempt. And the reason is immediately obvious when you look at the numbers. A modest regional park one that could realistically draw 500,000 to 1 million visitors a year requires somewhere between $50 million and $200 million just to get to opening day. That covers land acquisition, grading and infrastructure, utilities, parking, fencing, ticketing systems, support buildings, landscaping, and your initial ride package. And that's before you've hired anyone or started any marketing. A single major roller coaster, the kind of headline attraction that makes people drive 3 hours, costs between $15 million and $30 million on its own. Steel coasters from manufacturers like Bolliger & Mabillard, Intamin, or Vekoma aren't priced like amusement park rides in the way most people imagine. They're priced like custom-engineered infrastructure projects, because that's essentially what they are. Every track layout is unique, every support structure is designed for that specific terrain, and the testing and safety certification process alone adds months and cost to every installation. Disney and Universal operate in a completely different financial universe. Disney World has had years where a single new land like Star Wars Galaxy's Edge cost over $1 billion to develop. But those are outliers that distort public perception of what amusement parks actually cost. For most parks in America, $25 million is a major investment, and $200 million is a generational one. Here's where it gets interesting, because even after you've built everything and opened your gates, the cost structure of running a park is nothing like most people expect. Labor is the single largest operating expense for most parks. typically consuming 35 to 45% of revenue. Amusement parks are extraordinarily labor-intensive. On a busy summer weekend, a mid-sized regional park might have 1,500 to 2,000 employees on site simultaneously. Ride operators, safety inspectors, food service workers, security staff, maintenance crews, retail associates, guest services teams, parking attendants, the list is enormous. And because most parks are heavily seasonal, peaking from May through September. They have to staff up massively during summer and then manage the cost of dramatically reduced operations in the off-season. Many parks rely heavily on seasonal workers, including international workers on J-1 visas, specifically because the labor demand is so concentrated and domestic applicants at minimum or near minimum wages are increasingly difficult to retain. Maintenance and capital expenditure is the second major cost that catches new owners off guard. Rides don't just run forever. They require daily inspections, regular component replacements, annual certifications by state regulators, and periodic full refurbishments. A major roller coaster can cost $500,000 to $2 million per year just in ongoing maintenance, depending on age, design, and ridership volume. Older parks carrying aging ride fleets can find maintenance consuming an alarming share of their operating budget. And when something does fail, even something minor, the regulatory response can be swift and expensive. Then there's insurance. Amusement parks carry some of the most complex commercial insurance packages of any consumer business. Liability coverage, property insurance, business interruption policies, and specialized ride coverage together can cost a mid-sized park anywhere from $2 million to $10 million annually, depending on their ride count, incident history, and state requirements. And insurers price this coverage knowing that a single serious incident can generate litigation measured in the tens of millions. Energy costs are often underestimated by people outside the industry. Running dozens of high-power rides, lighting a park after dark, cooling food service areas, and maintaining water park attractions during summer heat adds up quickly. A large regional park might spend $3 million to $8 million annually on utilities alone. When you add all of this together, labor, maintenance, insurance, energy, food and beverage cost of goods, marketing, debt service, many parks operate on total operating margins of 15 to 25% in a good year. Smaller parks with less pricing power often do worse. And that's assuming the weather cooperates. Which brings us to one of the most underappreciated risks in this entire business one that no amount of business planning fully eliminates. Weather. It sounds almost trivial when you list it alongside regulatory risk and capital expenditure. But for an amusement park, weather isn't just an inconvenience. It is an existential financial variable. A park that draws 95% of its revenue between Memorial Day and Labor Day, roughly 14 weeks, has almost no ability to recover from a bad summer. 3 consecutive rainy weekends in July can erase hundreds of thousands of dollars in expected revenue. A major hurricane or regional flood can close a park for days or weeks during its most valuable operating window. And unlike a restaurant or retail store, you can't make up for a lost Saturday at an amusement park. That day is simply gone. Parks in northern climates have it particularly hard. Cedar Point in Ohio, for example, operates roughly 130 to 150 days per year. Every single one of those days carries enormous revenue pressure. When Cedar Point was owned by Cedar Fair before its 2023 merger with Six Flags, the company publicly described weather as one of its top 3 operational risks in annual filings, year after year without exception. And Cedar Fair was a publicly traded company with diversified park ownership across 13 properties, meaning it had more weather risk buffering than most operators. For a single park independent operator, one catastrophic season can be company-ending. It's one of the primary reasons that independent amusement park ownership has been slowly consolidating toward large chains that can absorb bad years against the performance of their broader portfolio. Now comes the part nobody talks about when they dream about owning a theme park, the revenue model. and specifically why it's far more complicated than just selling tickets. Ticket revenue is actually one of the lower margin components of an amusement park's total business. The real money, the high margin money, comes from in park spending. And the industry has spent decades engineering the guest experience specifically to maximize that number. Think about how a modern amusement park charges you. There's the gate admission, which for a regional park typically runs $40 to $85 per person for a single day ticket purchased at the gate. But parks have increasingly moved towards season passes priced aggressively, sometimes as low as $80 to $150 for an entire season, because a season pass holder comes back multiple times and spends money on food, games, and merchandise each visit, while also reducing the park's reliance on uncertain single-day walk-up attendance. Six Flags famously pushed ultra-cheap season passes for years, sometimes pricing them under $60, specifically to drive in-park spending volume. Then there's the tiered pricing architecture that has become the industry standard. Premium parking, $20 to $35. Fast lane or front-of-line passes, $50 to $100 per person on top of admission. Cabana rentals at water parks, $200 to $500 per day. Dining plans, $30 to $60 per person. Photo packages, locker rentals, character meet and greet experiences, refillable souvenir cups. Every element has been carefully priced to extract incrementally more spending from guests who have already paid to get in. Food and beverage alone typically represents 25 to 35% of a park's total revenue. And the margins on in-park food are extraordinary, by restaurant standards often 60 to 70%, because the park has a captive audience that cannot leave to find alternatives without losing their spot for the day. The $6 bottle of water and the $18 chicken tender basket aren't accidents of poor menu planning. They are the business model. Disney has mastered this structure to an almost absurd degree. Disney World's average revenue per guest, meaning the total they extract from a single visitor accounting for hotels, food, merchandise, and park tickets, has exceeded $200 per person per park day in recent years, and in some estimates pushes toward $250 to $300 when you include resort stays. That number would have seemed impossible 2 decades ago. And it didn't happen by accident. Here's where the business splits into 2 very different realities depending on who owns the park. If you're a large publicly traded company like the merged Six Flags Entertainment, which now operates over 40 parks across North America following the 2023 Cedar Fair merger, you have access to capital markets, institutional financing, and the ability to spread risk across dozens of properties. You can borrow money at reasonable rates to fund major capital projects, negotiate bulk purchasing contracts with ride manufacturers, and weather a bad season without threatening the entire enterprise. These companies carry significant debt, often in the range of $2 billion to $4 billion, but their cash generation capacity during strong operating years is sufficient to service it. If you're an independent regional park operator, and there are hundreds of these across the country, many of them family-owned across multiple generations, the financial picture is fundamentally different. You're typically financing major capital improvements through a combination of retained earnings, bank loans, and occasionally public incentive programs from local governments who see tourism value in having an attraction anchor. Your debt capacity is limited. Your insurance costs are proportionally higher. Your ability to absorb a bad year is narrow, and the competitive pressure on these independent operators has never been greater, not just from other parks, but from the entire entertainment landscape. An independent amusement park isn't just competing with Six Flags or Disney for vacation dollars. It's competing with streaming services, video game ecosystems, water parks, sports events, music festivals, and every other claim on the discretionary spending of families who have more entertainment options than any generation in history. The regulatory environment adds another layer of complexity that most outsiders dramatically underestimate. Amusement parks operate under a web of overlapping regulation. At the federal level, The Consumer Product Safety Commission has jurisdiction over mobile rides, the kind you see at traveling carnivals, but fixed-site parks in most states fall primarily under state regulation. And state regulation varies wildly. Some states, like New Jersey and California, maintain rigorous inspection programs with full-time ride safety inspectors employed by the government. Others have minimal formal oversight, relying more heavily on the park's own inspection protocols and third-party certifiers. Every ride must be inspected daily before it opens. Any mechanical anomaly, unusual noise, or sensor failure triggers an immediate shutdown protocol. And the cost of a safety incident in both direct liability and reputational damage means parks invest heavily in safety programs well beyond what regulators strictly require. A serious accident at a park can trigger years of litigation, multi-million-dollar settlements, permanent reputational damage, and insurance premium increases that compound for years afterward. The 2021 incident at Icon Park in Orlando, where a teenager died on a freestanding drop tower attraction, illustrates how quickly a single incident can reshape an entire park's trajectory. The ride was permanently removed. The park faced severe reputational damage during what should have been its peak operating season. Regulatory scrutiny of similar attractions nationwide increased measurably, and the family of the victim pursued litigation that took years to resolve. For a small independent operator, that scenario isn't just tragic, it can be terminal. So what does the best case scenario actually look like? And how does it compare to the worst? A well-run regional park in a strong demographic market, drawing 800,000 to 1, 2 million visitors annually, generating $50 to $90 million in revenue, operating at 20 to 25% EBITDA margins, meaning $10 to $22 million in earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization is a genuinely valuable business. The land alone often appreciates meaningfully over time. The brand loyalty in regional markets can be extraordinary, with families visiting the same park for 3 and 4 generations. And parks that invest consistently in new capital attractions tend to maintain attendance better than those that don't. Cedar Point is the clearest American example of long-term success done right. Operating continuously since 1870 on a peninsula in Lake Erie, Cedar Point has reinvented itself repeatedly across 150 years by consistently investing in world-class attractions, maintaining a distinct identity as a coaster destination, and cultivating an almost cult-like enthusiast following. It's a park that doesn't need Disney IP because it built its own mythology. And that mythology has real economic value. It draws visitors from across the country and internationally specifically because of the park's reputation, not because of any licensed character. The worst-case scenario looks very different. Parks that underinvest in capital either because of debt constraints or short-term financial pressure enter a deterioration cycle that's very hard to reverse. Aging ride fleets reduce the park's ability to attract first-time visitors. Repeat visitors who remember the park in better days become disillusioned. Attendance drops. Revenue falls. The park cuts costs further, reducing maintenance and staff quality, which worsens the guest experience, which drops attendance further. It's a loop that has destroyed dozens of parks across the country over the past 30 years. Six Flags went bankrupt in 2009, partly because it had accumulated so much acquisition debt while simultaneously underinvesting in its park's operational quality. The parks themselves weren't the problem, the financial structure built on top of them was, and that's a lesson the amusement park industry has learned painfully and repeatedly. Looking forward, the industry is navigating a genuinely interesting transition point. Technology is reshaping the park experience in ways that create both new revenue opportunities and new cost pressures. Dynamic pricing borrowed from the airline industry is becoming standard, with parks charging more for peak summer weekend visits and discounting aggressively for slower periods. App-based virtual queuing reduces the friction of wait times and gives parks detailed behavioral data on where guests spend their time and money. Biometric ticketing, contactless payments, and RFID wristbands are eliminating the friction points that historically cost parks revenue. Meanwhile, the entertainment experiences parks are investing in are growing in ambition and cost. The era of simply adding a new roller coaster every few years is being supplemented by immersive IP-driven land developments, augmented reality integrations, and resort infrastructure designed to capture multi-day visits rather than single days. Disney and Universal essentially pioneered this model, and regional parks are now attempting scaled-down versions of it. The challenge is that all of this costs money, significant money, at a time when interest rates have risen from their historic lows and capital access has become more expensive for the industry broadly. The large chains entered the mid-2020s carrying substantial debt loads, and the cost of servicing that debt while simultaneously maintaining aging infrastructure and funding new capital projects creates a financial balancing act that doesn't leave much margin for error. And yet, despite all of this, the amusement park remains one of those businesses that people genuinely love. That emotional relationship between a park and its community is a real economic asset. It drives loyalty, forgiveness, and advocacy that most businesses can only dream about. The kid who rode their first roller coaster at a regional park in 1995 is now a parent bringing their own kids to ride it again. That kind of brand equity doesn't show up cleanly on a balance sheet, but it absolutely shows up in attendance figures and in the community support parks receive when times get difficult. The economics of owning an amusement park are, in the end, a story about the gap between perception and reality, and about how businesses that look magical from the outside are often grinding, capital-intensive operations held together by precise financial engineering, obsessive operational discipline, and a consumer relationship unlike almost anything else in the entertainment world. The parks that survive don't do so because the amusement park business is easy. They survive because they understand every layer of what makes it hard, and they make smart decisions within those constraints year after year. The ones that fail almost always underestimate the capital requirements, overestimate attendance projections, or get caught in a debt structure that leaves no room to adapt when the inevitable bad season arrives. If you ever find yourself standing in line for a roller coaster on a perfect summer day, surrounded by the smell of funnel cake and the sound of people screaming with delight, just know that somewhere in that park, there's an operations director watching a weather radar, a finance team tracking per cap, spending against budget, and a maintenance crew that hasn't taken a day off since May. The joy is real. The business behind it is just extraordinarily complicated.